When I started in seminary, in one of our plenary orientations, we were told that pastors are the doorkeepers at life's transitions. That is, we would spend our careers presiding over the rituals that mark the most dramatic changes in the lives of our parishioners. We would dedicate a newborn child. We baptize young people on the threshold of adulthood. We conduct the weddings and the funerals in the lives of families. It is a largely symbolic role, but it formalizes the deep reality that they actually experience through an understandable community ritual. But this role is not always purely symbolic. Sometimes the rituals take on profound importance. Like the day I helped a young father take his infant son's casket out of the back seat of a limo. A child whom I had just held a dedication service for a couple of weeks earlier, now ready to be placed in the family cemetery. And yeah, we perform weddings, one of my least favorite tasks because of all of the ego and expense that's so often involved in a wedding, but we are usually also around for the divorces as well. And sometimes that is not just sad, sometimes it's dangerous. In my 41 years in ministry, I have rescued women from abusive homes. I have wrestled guns out of the hands of drug addicts who were bent on killing their families. I've chased a runaway teen into a heroin den where she lived and carried her out in my arms, stepping over the strewn bodies of addicts lying strewn about the floor. And of course, we do funerals, but on a few occasions before the funeral, I've been called upon to escort the grieving mother into the apartment where her son had committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in the living room. Or standing outside the intensive care unit with a husband who has to make the decision whether to ask for the extreme measure of invasive surgery or to allow his beloved spouse to die in peace. Rituals can be symbolic, but it would be a mistake to say that they are merely symbolic. They are not. Sometimes they are necessary. Sometimes they're healing. Sometimes they're comforting. And there are moments even when they can be inspiring. But sometimes they're absolutely crucial. Beyond these priestly functions, however, there is the role of pastor as a teacher. I've done more than my share of Bible study classes, but teaching is not always done from the classroom or a pulpit. Sometimes it's when you take a busload of teenagers to Appalachia to teach them compassion, literally, by driving them to make home health care visits to rundown mobile homes deep in the woods, or to clean up alleyways in a Chicago housing project full of drug paraphernalia and the residue of the sex trade. And I've taken teams of adults to help families restore their homes after a hurricane in New Orleans, or to Central America to build houses and dig wells for some of the most impoverished people in this hemisphere. A great deal of what pastors do is teach orthodoxy, the right and true beliefs that are core to a particular faith community. But I have found the classroom to be more of an impediment to education than a real center of learning. Learning how to mix mortar in a depression in the ground with a shovel and a few buckets of water, and then carrying that mortar in 10-gallon buckets on your shoulder to the people who are laying blocks, moving a family from a shack made of mud and sticks into a real house, a house with a floor and a door. Those are lessons not easily forgotten. Sometimes a pastor is called upon simply to be present in the midst of chaos, in the midst of a terrible crisis. You go and sit in a prison cell with someone who might be innocent and also might be terribly guilty. And to courtrooms where I've sat beside a young woman who was looking for a little extra strength for the moment that she would have to go and sit in the witness stand and testify about how her stepfather had sexually molested her, or to sit with a family who had to watch their grown child be sentenced unjustly to years in prison for an offense that should have never resulted in a day of incarceration. Life in ministry is a life full of wonder and celebration, mixed with terrible failure and unbearable sadness. You know, folks, every addict doesn't get sober. In fact, most do not. Most of them die. Marriage doesn't always end in a healthy life together, or even reconciliation after marriage counseling. In fact, it usually doesn't. Domestic violence tends to get worse rather than better. But what our seminary lecturer did not say back in that fall, back in 1980 at Vanderbilt, is that the best pastors are the ones who also strive to be prophets, who also stand as the doorman for the passageways of an entire society. We don't hear their names very often, but the poor have Washington Gladden, a New York congregational pastor, to thank for the fact that electricity wasn't just something generated in wealthy neighborhoods and sold to the wealthy, but became a public utility with wires spread into poor neighborhoods as well as to gated communities. It was Dorothy Day who forced the early 20th century city dwellers to see and to care for the hungry and the homeless during the Great Depression. The church has been guilty of many horrible sins. The church has been guilty of humiliating hypocrisy. But who would want to live in an America that had not been transformed by the leadership of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.? Who would want to live in a world not influenced by the anti-colonial efforts of Mahatma Gandhi? I found my own prophetic voice in the early 1990s as the AIDS epidemic made both politicians and preachers use the fear of AIDS to vilify the gay community. Taking up the cause of gay rights was not a natural move for me. I had not grown up in a woke family, and my education had hardly prepared me for the hatred and fear that I would face in trying to bring liberation to the marginalized who happened not to have been born heterosexual. Working with alcoholics, you learn to accept failure in 4 out of 5 cases. When you're trying to help society through a gateway into a new way of living, you're likely to fail and fail and fail 1,000 times before you see success. I was a part of countless demonstrations before it became legal for same-sex couples to be married. We led hundreds of demonstrations against America's illegal wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan with no discernible effect on public policy. We have demonstrated locally against the payday loan industry, in support of Planned Parenthood, and in favor of giving a living wage to food industry workers. Sometimes being a prophetic pastor demands that you keep planting seeds that you will never see grow to a harvest. But to borrow my favorite line from Bruce Coburn's song, Lovers in a Dangerous Time, we have to keep kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. We are now in a time in history when the old models of what it meant to be a church are passing away. Many churches that were already in steep decline will simply never reemerge from this global pandemic. And in many cases, you got to admit, that might be a good thing. The church has had a long and sordid history of defending slavery, of supporting the ruling class at the expense of the poor, of teaching and perpetuating homophobia, perpetuating racism, and covering up the crimes of pedophile priests and pastors. When I see small churches being transformed into large family homes or cathedrals turned into office parks or shopping malls, I have to tell you, I have some mixed feelings about that. I have lived within the 4 walls of the institutional church I can tell you for my entire adult life, my mother was the church secretary of my home church. I've been setting up folding tables and folding bulletins as long as I could walk. And I know how toxic church politics and denominational power can be. As the Florida pastor James Harnish once said, the church is like Noah's Ark. The only way to stand the stench on the inside is to remember the storm on the outside. In my youth, I had some church leadership who were people that I looked up to, and I aspired to be like them. In the waning days of my time as a denominational minister, I barely survived an area minister and a regional minister here in Missouri who were guilty of embezzling church funds and hiding serious sex crimes on the part of denominational leaders. I know a lot of people who are in prison who should not be, but these two men should certainly be in prison right now. But they were allowed to coast into retirement, suffering no consequences for their crimes and showing no signs of having even a thimbleful of conscience between the two of them. Churches are self-selected communities, and so many friendships, as well as romances, are discovered in the process of being a community. The very nature of a voluntary association that deals with the most important and the most controversial issues that life has to offer will draw people towards its voice and its vigor. And some of them are drawn to it for reasons of ego or sociopathy, because they then choose to try to destroy what originally attracted them. It took me a long time to realize that most of the people who want to push you up onto a pedestal are doing so because they have an unconscious need to watch you fall off of it. It's easy to think of these people as having malignant intent, but looking back over the past 40 years of my relationships in churches, I'm willing to conclude that most people simply do not know how to be a friend. For the most part, when we say, "I love you," we say it with a very large I and a very small U. I think that one of the most powerful aspects of the gospel accounts of the Passion narrative is if you read it paying close attention to the friendships within it. As they are written, there were a dozen men in that inner circle of Jesus' associates. Most of them slept through the moments of crisis, never aware and never wanting to get involved. Peter, whose protestations of love and loyalty were the strongest, showed that hypocrisy was his most pronounced characteristic. The literary creation of Judas, who was not a historical character, but a literary creation. His very name, Judas, represents Judah, it represents the entire faith community. But as the narrative is written, representing Judas as a single person, he gets involved in a lethal way, betraying Jesus with a kiss. The gospel writers would have us to believe that Judas was motivated by greed, but it is evident to me through these decades of pastoral life that sociopaths destroy the lives of leaders out of envy. Over the years of publishing my newspaper columns and now posting my sermons online, I've had hundreds of pieces of hate mail, dozens of death threats, and a couple of attempts. But such stuff is like what Soren Kierkegaard called being stomped to death by geese. They hardly matter. It takes someone you love very much to really be able to hurt you, to get close enough to drive the dagger deeply into your heart. A lot of energy over the past 41 years has been consumed by betrayals and defeats, senseless ego battles, and boardroom politics over budgets and personnel. I have witnessed the toxic, seamy underbelly of organized religion, and I am entirely sympathetic with the majority of people in the world who want nothing to do with it. But it isn't really fair to judge a home by just looking into the content of the septic tank. The perspective on life from the vantage point of the sewer is never rosy. The only proverb that is original to me, the only one that I will go to my grave saying that I came up with all by myself, and I came up with it 30 years ago, is that if you light a candle in a dark place, you will draw bugs. That is, if you try to accomplish anything that is really important, something noteworthy, anything heroic, critics will literally come crawling out of the woodwork. Still, I refuse to define my life in ministry based on the chirping of the frogs from the sewer. You know, folks, lions don't waste a lot of time worrying about what sheep think. 45 years ago, I thought that I wanted to go to law school, but I became persuaded that there were a lot of good lawyers in the world, but there were not many good preachers. Once in grad school, I realized that the majority of demands for my time was in pastoral counseling, and I considered becoming a licensed psychologist. But again, I became convinced that there's a lot of really excellent psychologists in the field, but finding an outstanding preacher was almost impossible. So I have devoted my life to becoming one. And I'm going to have to leave it to you to decide whether I ever accomplish that goal or not. For myself, in spite of the hardships and conflicts, I judge my commitment to the church and specifically to the pulpit as having been worth it. Whether I ever became a really good preacher or not, I'm deeply grateful for having been given the opportunity to try for the past 4 decades. I find myself now standing in the doorway of yet another transition. This is not my retirement speech. I hope that it will be a few years before I have to deliver that one. But this is certainly marking a transition, as David Ketchum and I will try to share this one job between the two of us. Fate brought David to us a few years ago, and I could not have found a co-pastor with whom to share a pulpit that I respect and trust more than I do David. This transition also affirms the fact that we primarily will be an online church, providing messages and content to thousands of people around the globe, while still remaining rooted in a small seated congregation here in the most unlikely of places, Springfield, Missouri, where a progressive voice is almost always in danger. My crystal ball is all foggy. I don't know what the future of church life will look like in the next decade. I don't have any better idea what my life will look like in the next decade. But I am confident that people of faith have a vital role in shaping the world that is now emerging. There is no retirement from kicking at the darkness. I hope that preaching less often will just give me an opportunity to finally get better at it.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.